Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Christine Perfetti, and I am the founder of Lift Up Connections and also the host and moderator for today. I am so excited to have June Bauer here with us today. Hi, June.
Hello, hello.
Hi, thanks for joining. For those of you who haven't had a chance to see June's work, June is a pioneer. She's a pioneer in the business world, the product world, the marketing world. She's someone that I have turned to for more than a decade, close to 2 decades, for advice in all of those areas. She's my go-to resource to be talking about positioning, business strategy, product strategy. She's a powerhouse in the field and in the industry. So I'm thrilled to have her here today. I warned June that I might share where and when we met, but the reason I wanted to bring it up, the purpose behind Lift Up Connections, we talk a lot about career and life inflection points. And I recall exactly when I met you, June. It was in 2007. It was while you were leading up marketing at Webex. And I remember this because I was going through one of the biggest, most pivotal chapters of my life where I moved from the East Coast to the West Coast to the Bay Area. I left my job after giving a year's notice, which is unheard of. I left my full-time job to start my new business. When I moved out to the West Coast, Webex was my first client ever.
Wow.
On my own. So it was a very memorable experience. But what was most memorable to me was meeting you. As
Oh,
I mentioned, June was leading up the marketing team at Webex. This was during a period where Cisco had acquired Webex. And I was so impressed and amazed with your leadership skills with the team. Going through that period, there were a couple of other areas that it's one of the reasons why I turn to you so often is that I was so amazed by how much you care about people. And by people, the people you led, all of your internal team members, also, and just as importantly, the customers and users. I have very rarely interacted with an executive who cares as deeply about ensuring everyone in the organization understands what's going on with users and customers and making that the heart of an organization. So I am thrilled now, 17 years later, that I have you on the program. So thank you so much for joining me, June.
I am honored to be here, Christine, and I really appreciate those remarks. It was lovely. Thank you.
Of course, now this is an unfair request on my part. I only shared the little piece of your career, and it was just a little snippet leading up the team at WebEx. Here's the hard part. In a minute or two, can you share with us a little bit about your life and career trajectory and some background?
I certainly can, and I will do it in a manner, hopefully, that will keep everybody awake, because I know you're all here really for yourselves and hopefully to learn some things you can put to use and not for me. So let me keep it very brief and say, I was born and raised in the Silicon Valley. I knew from a very young age I wanted to be in computers, although I majored in something unrelated to computers. It was not a big thing when I was going to college. And I got a series of jobs in computers. I was lucky enough to work at Apple in the very early days. There's about 200 people in the company, worked with Steve Jobs, learned marketing there. And then I went on to a series of marketing roles in this valley where I still live. I was the vice president of brand at Adobe. I was head of corporate communications at Cisco. As Christine said, I was the CMO at Webex. And then I was the CMO at many companies, some public, some private. And about 10 years ago, I decided, like Christine at one point in her life, that I wanted to be a consultant on my own and started doing marketing consulting. But quickly that evolved into something that I'm personally really passionate about, and that is helping people learn how to succeed at work. Because I know when I started work, I thought, oh, I just have to do a really good job and I'll get promoted. And what I quickly realized was not true. In fact, sometimes your job has very little to do with your success. And I created a series of workshops, everything from how do you influence people, how do you give and get feedback, how do you use your power for good, something we're talking about today, how do you run meetings, all these kinds of topics that are going to help people actually be successful. I offer to companies, I've done them for companies like GoFundMe, HP, I've done them for Stanford University, many different Dropbox companies. And it's a 2-hour workshop and it's very participatory. And that's what I've been doing for the past few years. And I really love it. So that's me in a nutshell. And as Christine said, I am an entrepreneur and a pioneer, and I let nothing stop me. And I'm a bit of a troublemaker too.
Troublemaker. I'm going to have the ladies join us in just a couple of minutes. I'd love to have a chance to introduce you, June. But before we do, I'd be curious your take. When I hear troublemaker, I sometimes equate that with someone that also is willing to grasp their power and authenticity and use it. I'm wondering, when you describe yourself as a troublemaker, I'm curious, do you think of that as a good thing?
Yes, yes to everything. But I do have to say, being a troublemaker, it can be just like power. It can be good and it can be bad. We saw people, I don't know if you guys watched the debate, but it's on my mind. And we saw people in that debate using power for good and for bad. We saw some interesting uses of power in that debate. I have to say, slightly off, but it's on my mind as well. I'm sure you guys have all seen The Wizard of Oz. And I know as a kid, I loved that movie. And I have to say today, I still love it. I've seen it
I
so
do too.
I love it. And as I was working on this workshop, which I do in companies, I was thinking about The Wizard of Oz. It came to mind to me. I thought, why is that? I started thinking about the movie and I realized that Dorothy, she gets to Oz. She's given these ruby slippers. She kills a witch, but she thinks nothing of it. It just happened. And then she meets two very powerful women, right? She meets the good witch and the bad witch, but they are very powerful. Dorothy herself doesn't feel powerful because she wants to get home and she doesn't know how to. Then she goes to the wicked witch who says, hey, if you get me these things, the broomstick, right? I'm going to send you home. And what Dorothy eventually realizes is that witch was bad and she was using power for bad. And if she just threw water on her, that she would do away with her, which she did. And the last scene shows Dorothy with Glinda the Good Witch saying, hey, you could have gotten home at any time in this journey because you have the ruby slippers and all you have to do is tap them together. But Dorothy wasn't ready to understand she had that power. Therefore, she couldn't use the ruby slippers. And she did show she can use power by throwing the water on the witch, right? So it's a wonderful story about power. I could sit here and talk about it forever, but
Yeah.
the takeaway really is that you need to start this power journey by believing you have power. Even if you don't feel you're powerful, you have power. And what you need to learn is, what is that power and how do you use it? I have a quote here from Alice Walker that I just love. I'm going to share it with you. It says, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. So if you want to be powerful, the first step in your power journey is to learn that you do have it and learn what that power is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, June. As I ask you a follow-up question to that, I'd love to invite Stephanie, Diana, and Mary to join us. If all three of you would like to put on your videos, turn on your audio. June, as everyone's joining, first, let's say hello. Hello, ladies. Thanks for joining. Hello. We're really happy to have you here. June, I wanted to start with a question, and it may be a question I anticipate you may throw it back to us. There's a lot of discussion about power. Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz learned how to embrace her power. I hear people, especially women, discuss power in different ways. And I'm wondering, before we jump into asking you about how we can get it, how do you define power?
Yeah, I think the word you just used, Christine, that I think is really important in power discussions is the word feel. Because I think we all have feelings about power. And I want to just turn it back to our panel here and ask you guys, how do you feel about power?
It depends on who we're talking about, who has it. Basically, just like you were talking about, June, there's people who are using power for good versus bad. When I think about it, I think I use power for good, I hope. But when I define power and how I'm trying to use it, it's about focusing on being the authentic me, being as authentic as I possibly can, and bringing that authenticity and identity to my work and my interactions with people. And I'm really focusing there. If you ask me, and these group of ladies, we've talked a lot about power in the wrong hands and the people who have power, where sometimes with a patriarchy, it very much feels like the men have the power. I feel very differently about power in that way. I feel sometimes that can be unfair and there's systems in place that block women. So that's how I think about power. Ladies, what are your thoughts?
I'll start on this one. So when June mentioned the debate last night, it reminds me of Kamala Harris as our vice president and candidate running for president. She had to walk a fine line of when and when not to assert her air quotes power. And it reminds me of the societal norms that we've absorbed of what is good power, bad power, and how to assert yourself, especially as a woman, her, a woman of color. Yeah, that's what, when I'm training folks to be in that kind of position, it's first peeling back the layers that we have to break down the societal barriers that women can be powerful and that is normal. And it reminds me of a book a long time ago that I read. And if you haven't read it, I really highly recommend it. Rachel Simmons, she's out in Western Massachusetts, and she wrote the book, The Curse of the Good Girl. And what it was is raising authentic girls with courage and confidence. And the reason why I love that book is because the way we've raised our girls, and the most simple example I'll give is your child comes home and they're a young lady, they're a girl, and they were in the art room and somebody messed up their artwork. And the normal response or the societal response is, oh, just go back and play nice. Go back and play nice. We've pre-programmed our young girls not to learn how to deal with conflict, to own their power in a conflicting situation, and how to teach them how to work through it. It goes back to what society and what we have pre-absorbed, as June mentioned in the Wizard of Oz example, is we have it. We have it. And somewhere along the line, it has been taken away from us for whatever reason. And it's our job to come together to collectively to find that power again and start to use it.
I have to say, I love that. That was just so beautifully put. And I want to just add one thing. I do a workshop on personal brand. And exactly to your point, I cannot tell you the number of times, because I've done that workshop many times, that the women, when I ask, what is it that makes you special? They say, I'm nice. I'm nice. I do what people want me to do. And every time they say that, I have to really hold myself back from going berserk, because
right.
Yeah, we should all be nice. Nice is a good thing, but it isn't the value that you bring at work. Nice isn't the value that you bring. The very weak position. And in fact, it is really a position of giving up your power.
Yeah.
It's rolling over like a dog and saying, well, I'm nice, so I'm going to help you. That's my value, helping you. It's like people going to people and going, hey, what can I do to help? Okay, once in a while, that's fine. But a much more powerful statement would be, I need your help, and here's what I need. And that flips it around. But you're so right. Women want to say many times, not all, but many times, my value is I'm nice. And that is not going to help us to ultimately influence and change the world in a better way.
Right.
Thank you, June, for talking to us. This is great. I come at the idea of power in slightly different way. So I do a political podcast and I'm a historian. So I think about power as is it institutional power? Is it personal power? Is it formal or informal or influential or self-aware? So like last night, I'm going to write an article about this, and it reminded me of the Barbie speech. Did you guys all see Barbie last year? Right?
Oh.
Women have to, right? Women have to be thin, but they can't try to be thin. They have to smile, but not too much. They have to serious, but not harsh, assertive, but not angry, right? So there's perception and then there's real power. So there's so many different elements that I have swirling around. Institutionally, power can come from what the position is that you have in an organization. Or if you don't have very much power, it can come from the power of your influence and your ability to influence and get people to do what you want them to do.
Mm.
And your own self-awareness about your own power has a lot to do with understanding yourself and what brings value to your organization, and then how to both use that, but also treat the others around you, not nicely, but kindly and with compassion.
Mm.
So that's where I am. And I could have a conversation all day about the debate last night and how, what role power played. And so I am so excited to have this conversation.
So, Stephanie, how do you feel about your own power?
I feel optimistic and strong. I feel like I don't have institutional power. I have influential power, but more and more people are listening to what I have to say. And intellect has always been like the point of pride, the point of weakness, right? The thing that it's the hubris. But finally, I feel like I get to use it in a way where people they want to hear what I have to say, which is kind of awesome.
So you found a way to use what's special about you, your personal brand, to bring value in a way that's very visible. I think that's really awesome. I love it. Beautiful.
So I think maybe because I wasn't that nice of a girl, I don't struggle so much with that. But one of the things that I have seen and experienced in my time in tech is a woman who's an executive now that I used to work with recently posted about a time early in her career when she was told, "You're not technical enough." Meanwhile, she was a licensed electrical engineer, and the person giving her this feedback had majored in economics in school. And I have witnessed many times in my career that being used against women, despite whether or not it's accurate. Have never in 25 years heard it to describe a man. And I can assure you there were plenty of men that I worked with that were not, in fact, technical enough. So what do you do when you're in a situation where the power is being taken away from you, despite your experience, your knowledge, your role, your influence that you have, that you've got people who are just coming in and dismissing it out of hand with these coded gender words?
Yeah, I think sometimes when you're willing to give up your power quickly, or this is just in general, many women will say, "I'm nice," and they will back away from conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And conflict and saying no are tremendous sources of power. In fact, I think a lot of women give up the opportunity to be powerful by always saying yes. We don't want conflict, most of us, and we're uncomfortable with it. And in those kinds of situations, now it's highly dependent upon context and what's really going on, but expertise is another form of power. I love, Stephanie, your list, and I have a list too, but I like to talk about expertise because that's one that's actually very comfortable for a lot of women to be very good at something.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, it only goes so far if people don't recognize it. So one of the things you have to do, and it may not change overnight. I mean, there's two options here. One is to have a direct conversation about it and really bring up all the points about show what you've done if you're an expert. Don't back away right away because someone doesn't believe you. And I think that's a really hard thing. It's easy for me to say, really hard to do if you're not comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also really good to not engage in a conflict right away. Go away, think about it, put your case together. Don't make it emotional, but come back with facts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one way to do it. Another thing that you can do is build your personal brand. And I'll tell you, I have a very quick story about this because it was so meaningful to me. In my very first job out of college, I worked at a big computer company. I got a job in sales, which was ridiculous. I'm not really a very good salesperson, but that was the job I got. And I knew nothing about business. There was another sales team there, and there were some really nice guys on that sales team, and it was a good group. One day I came into work and they said, "Oh, the guy who was the boss of that other team left, and we have promoted someone else to the role." I was like, oh, who got promoted? And they said, Dave got promoted. I went, Dave, you've got to be kidding me. He never made his quota. That guy never made his quota. To this day, I'm still astounded by it. But the thing, so funny, so nice, so engaging, everybody loved him. So the guy never made his quota, but people loved him. And that slammed me in the face like a big wave at the ocean. I was like, what? That's how people get promoted? By being someone people want to engage with? He was great at building relationships, Dave. To this day, he became CEO of many companies, by the way, just so you know. He was very smart. It's just that he wasn't a good closer, shall we say. But it really taught me right away that your ability to have power in an organization isn't based on the job that you do. And so you have to take responsibility for making sure people know what it is that's special about you. I was actually at another company where I was the head of the Macintosh product line. It was a networking company. And I came into work one day and they said, oh, we've promoted someone else to be your new boss who's head of all the products. And I was like, why didn't you talk to me about that? I would have liked that job. And they said to me, oh, we thought you loved Macintosh and you wouldn't want to do it. And I'd realized I'd created a brand for myself around Macintosh, not around marketing leadership. And that was actually, Christine, where I changed my personal brand to be all about customers, because the company was so technical. I started always asking, what about the customers? Have we talked to customers? And I got totally away from the Macintosh thing consciously, and I built it into everything that I did there. And I still do. And obviously, Christine saw it.
Absolutely, day one. And you're pointing to something, June, where it's know what's special about you.
Yes.
Define your personal brand.
Yes.
You did something beyond that, which I see some women struggling once you've defined your brand and you know your special skills. Shouting it out loud, acting on it, displaying in all of your behavior that this is who you are. And you're right. Day one, you were communicating your personal brand to me.
Yeah. So back to Diane, I think someone that is not being recognized, they've got to start really building that brand. And that's a longer term issue, but short term, you can have a frank discussion, but take the emotion out of it. But I love your examples. Fantastic.
This crosses over on all different areas. There's a couple of things that are layers when you pull back everything that folks have shared here is in the space when I'm helping candidates run for office, we talk about controlling their narrative because you have to control your narrative or somebody else will define it for you. But it goes back to one of the reasons why I think what's coming up for me is why women, especially women, don't run for office. They're afraid of conflict. But when we talk about all these things that you've brought up, June, things that Diana's brought up, these are skills that can be learned. When it reminds me that I was talking to my husband about something a while ago, public speaking, another reason people are afraid to run for office. Do you think all these executives learned how to get in front of these major conferences? They were trained. They were given an opportunity to learn how to public speak. So I don't know what it is about women, and we can talk about it for a second. We assume that if we don't have these skills, we're not good enough. Somewhere along the line, we have internalized, if we don't have them, if we don't feel like we are good enough, we've been signaled somewhere along the line that you cannot go off and learn them. And I think that's the one thing that we're talking about here is all these skills you can go and learn about them. You can mentor each other. We can lift each other up. We can build relationships to help fill the gaps with each other. Yeah, all these things are learned, and men learned them along the way. The difference, I would love to hear your folks' thoughts on that, is it happened more organically for men because they were brought along. They were taught. We just weren't taught. So now we have to teach each other.
I agree with you, but I will say one thing, which is, again, it's back to that word feel. We like to be very analytical about these things, but the reality is power is so associated with feeling.
Yeah.
And if you don't feel it, it's not going to happen for you, no matter what you learn. And I think it's really important for everybody to think about why they might be afraid of power. And let me just ask that question. Why might you all be afraid of power?
I'd like to tell you about an experience I had in the 90s in Silicon Valley. I was in a public relations firm, And my female bosses were abusive. They'd call me out in front of clients. They'd call everybody out in front of clients. And one day I was like, I'm done. I am not taking this shit anymore. I forget it. And I didn't say anything to them, but something about my carriage changed and I didn't get that crap anymore. So the thing that I just wanted to pull out is that understanding your self-worth can translate in all sorts of ways you don't necessarily
Good point.
know how it's going to be received. So I wanted to say that before any of the rest. But I also think the second side of that is for women, being perceived as powerful can be a negative. Later on in my career, my boss said, you're a little bit too big for your britches.
Yeah.
And you are too ambitious. Okay, he was whatever, an old white man. You're too ambitious. I know you think that's good, but it isn't. And so I think the fear of running up against those kinds of people and not knowing what to do when you find them, because sitting down and telling them you're valued actually doesn't work. I've tried that. So I think that could be part of the fear people have about being, feeling, or seeming powerful.
Great points.
Fear is really a tricky emotion, Stephanie, because a lot of what you were saying resonated with me about why I would be scared and feel fear. There's another element to it that I don't think I even realized until you asked us this question, June, about what makes you afraid of power. I've seen a pattern where many women don't doubt their abilities and expertise. They do the great work and sometimes stay behind the scenes to do that great work. And I've thought a lot about that. I've done that during my career where I would get frustrated and resentful that men were getting credit that I felt I earned, but there was fear there. I chose to stay behind the scenes. No one kept me in the corner. And the fear was more about fear of rejection, fear of if I display my power and I put myself out there, there will be some people out there who don't like me. And we've talked a lot about knowing where your feelings come from. This isn't something that just originated as an adult. It's my fear from way, way back of not being liked, of not being seen for my worth, of feeling rejected. And to have power, you need to put yourself out there. And I've been scared and fearful in the same way as you, Stephanie. And admittedly, I've been fearful of once I have that power, what will people say about me? And it's held me back. I've held myself back.
That's
Yeah.
such a story. And it's one that I think lots of people feel. I know I felt that way.
Totally relatable. It goes back to the likable piece. Women, that innate or that taught piece in our lives that we have to be liked first. And that if we're not liked, then we're not powerful. Then we're not going to get what has to be done achieved. The other thing that when you were bringing up, Christine, about being in the corner, I think women do a lot of what I like to coin invisible labor, because their fear, there's this fear factor of they've done the great work, but then somebody else takes credit for it and they don't own their own power and lean into it, create that conflict in the room. Hey, no, I'm sorry, but that was my project. And however, they had that, again, a skill of how to deal with conflict, take credit for their work. And then the snowball effect of that, I don't know if you folks have seen this, is then when it comes time for promotions, they're passed over because they weren't given credit for the job that they actually did. Yeah, so I have a question back for you, June. In terms of, there is a lot of fear associated with the power. How do you advise when you're doing your workshops for women? Because we've hit on a lot of different elements we've all experienced. At this stage of your career, your life transition, how do you work with women to undo some of those trained behaviors that we have put almost in the forefront of our work environments, but not knowing we're actually doing it.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think two questions that I really think are important to think about is when you are putting together, I like to ask women to put together a power plan, which is a plan that essentially helps you figure out what you're going to do to become more powerful. And I think putting that plan together is really helpful. It gives you confidence, it gives you structure, and it starts with something that's really simple, which is, what do I want? So many times I see women going into situations where what they want to do is be nice and be helpful. But that's not going to help you be powerful. So what do you really want? And when I say want, what I mean is, what do you want to influence? What do you want to change? Because power is really about influence. It's about how much influence can you have to make the world a better place, to make your office a better place, to make your customers happier, whatever you want to do. But be clear about what you want. And if you don't start with being clear about that, you're not going to be powerful. You're going to be wishy-washy.
Yep.
And you're going to be helpful, right? So
Mhm.
that's number one, is it's okay to want something for yourself and be clear about what that is. And that may change over time and there may be different situations, but whenever you're working, be clear about what you want. And it starts there. Then I think you need to really look at who are your stakeholders
Yeah.
for any initiative. Ultimately, if power is about influence, is about relationships. And it really comes down to building the right relationships, because even if your power comes through expertise, just like Diana's story, if you do not have relationships with people where they recognize that, you're screwed. A stakeholder plan is one where you identify who are all the people you need to build relationships with. And that shouldn't be people who don't have power. In other words, don't spend time with people who don't have power. I'm sorry, you may like them. You can definitely spend time with them as friends, but don't spend time at work with people who don't have power. They're not going to help you. And really strategically think about, how do I approach people? I've been working with one company right now where they have a fairly new CMO. She's been there 6 months. And I think there's only one person who set up a meeting with her to get to know her,
Wow.
which is crazy, because if I were there and I were a peon, I would be trying to meet her. So I think it's really important to think about, who do you need to meet, and to not hold yourself back on that. When I worked at this company where the guy got promoted for being a fun, great joke teller, I was getting my MBA at the time, and I said to myself, I was like just a total peon there. And I said, I want to meet the president of this company. And so I said, for my MBA, I had to do an interview. So I called his secretary and said, hey, can I talk to the head of the company? And she arranged a time, and I went up there and I met him. And then my boss found out about it, and he was like, oh, I hear you've been talking to the president of the company. Of course, I didn't know. I probably should have told him in advance I was going to do it. But anyway, so put the stakeholder plan together, make sure you meet with people who have power, have a reason to meet with them. And then I think there's 2 questions I advise people to ask themselves. And this is really back to this, Mary, this point you were bringing up, which is, the 2 questions are, how will I feel if I fail?
Mm.
And the other question is, how will I feel if I succeed? And I will tell you that in my career, I have seen more people than you can imagine upset about success.
Tell us more about that. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, let me tell you the story about, I was working at a company, I was head of marketing, and a woman worked for me who was head of advertising. And she had a woman who worked for her who ran one of the big advertising segments. And I loved that woman. I thought she was great. Her name was Alexis. And I thought she was wonderful at building relationships. She really knew advertising. She said to me and her boss, Jean, hey, I would really like to get promoted. And we said, hey, you got to do these things to get promoted. So she went off and did those things. And then for her next review, I talked to Jean and we both agreed she should be promoted now. She's definitely at that level. And so Jean went and did a review and said, Alexis, we're promoting you to the next level. We're giving you a lot more money and a lot more stock. And you would think when you have that conversation with someone, they'd be like, oh, yay. But you know what she did? She started to cry.
Oh, wow.
She was crying in that meeting uncontrollably. And Jean came and talked to me. She said, I cannot believe what happened when I told Alexis I expect her to be overjoyed. But Alexis, when she got what she wanted, she felt, number one, undeserving. And number two, she felt like now the expectations were so high, she was not going to be able to do her job. And I think this is really common with women more than men. But sometimes we fear being successful. It's almost like, Christine, your story of not wanting to be out in front. On one hand, people might notice you and they might not like you. On the other hand, they might notice you and like you a lot, and you might be incredibly successful. Those two questions, that might not be the case, but it's really important because, again, it comes back to how do you feel? Because your feelings can betray you without you even knowing it.
Yeah.
So it's really important to be aware of those things and give it a lot of consideration. And I think that's a great way to get started.
Yeah. Stephanie, I'd be curious. It relates to when Stephanie and I are talking in the political space is when we're building power in these states that haven't had it in a while, we talk about let's redefine what winning looks like. So everybody needs to really define what winning is going to look like for them. Like it might not be the title. It might be a job that gives you a little bit more freedom, but understanding what your winning looks like.
I love that. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
And also, I had a conversation yesterday with a woman who used to be president of Emily's List. And I was doing an interview and I said something about not being a candidate for office. I had done all these other things, but I'm not a candidate for office. And there are reasons. And she's like, yet. You're not a candidate for office yet. And I was like, fair point. But I think also we put ourselves in boxes. I was always you wouldn't know it now, but I was always the behind the scenes. When you're June, when you're in communications, you're the one telling people what to say. You're not out, unless you're like the spokesperson, you're mostly not out there doing it. And being the one in front of a camera or microphone can be very scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's the worst thing that could happen?
Yeah.
Well, you could be terrible at it.
Could be.
But you could also, yesterday, somebody said there are like 5 newsletters worth reading. And they listed Heather Cox Richardson, and they listed Simon Rosenberg, and they listed Scott Dworkin, and they listed me.
Wow.
I was like, what?
That's amazing, Stephanie.
That's awesome.
Congratulations.
I mean, that's only one person, but I was like, oh.
Yes.
Oh, I know. But there could be many more people who say that.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what I think that points out too, because I've been watching Stephanie in her work, and we're all growing in our own spaces. And I think one of the things that has allowed Stephanie to grow so much is relationships. I think you started to talk about that, June, and we have to know who the other stakeholders are and build those relationships. And I was just listening to a podcast this morning when I was on my bike ride. I didn't have my headset on. It was right here when I was biking, but it was about leadership in relationships. People don't understand the why their leadership is lacking a little bit. And it was Brene Brown, of course, and she was talking about relationships are also a pivotal point of leadership. Have you come across that when you're doing your workshops about how power relates to relationships and leads into better leadership roles?
I have never heard that exact kind of idea, which I think is very interesting. We talked a lot about relationships and how you build relationships and how you build a stakeholder plan and why it's important, but not the part about leadership.
Yeah, that was interesting too. Yeah.
Say a little more about that, because I'd love to hear a little more about how you're thinking.
Yeah, she was interviewing, his name was Mike, and I'm going to go back. You know how when you listen to a podcast, like
I
there was
know.
a lot there. I got to unpack that. And he was a 2-part series. He was lieutenant colonel in the military, and Renee had connected with him doing workshops at the West Point. And his book and his studies from Harvard was that when you want to lead organizations, you have to build that trust. And you also have to, and in order to do that, you have to build relationships. So then they started talking about accountability, because accountability, when we use that word, it can become a buzzy, scary, fuzzy word, because when you hold people accountable, it's either for good or didn't meet the expectations. But they were talking about how when we're in better relationships with folks, we can understand how to better hold each other accountable and lift each other up. Because I've had it many times when you've had people in the office and you're like, okay, we have to have the review, or you're talking about a project that didn't meet expectations, you need to hold people accountable. But when you're in relationship with them, you can understand why you didn't get there. Was it because you've created a space for your colleague to say, actually, I didn't feel supported in X, Y, or Z? You're like, oh, okay, we need to redirect that. So it goes back to you can become a better leader if you're a better relationship, more authentic conversations on that accountability piece, the trust, and the leadership piece that they were talking about. It all went back to relationships.
Yeah, I
Right,
think
we
that's
teach that.
really interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I founded a company that teaches leadership to mostly people in nonprofit and higher ed. And one of the things about leadership relationships and conversations is that there is a whole continuum, right? You could be having a very transactional relationship with somebody where I need something from you, you need something from me, we give it to each other and it's done. But then there's another level where that's cooperation, where you start giving each other more, being more involved in what the other is trying to achieve, and understanding what their interest is and what your interest is, and figuring out how it can converge. And then collaboration, which would be co-creation, like what we're doing with Christine, is understanding this other person and yourself and whatever the stakeholders are, and what can be accomplished when you're actually collaborating, as opposed to having a transactional relationship, or even somewhere in between where you're having good conversations and you're moving things along, but it's not truly co-creation.
Yeah.
So we talk about that a lot in terms of how a leader can understand going from the continuum of cooperation to collaboration.
I really like that model, Stephanie, because one of the traps I've seen mostly women fall into, when you're in a situation where you're not valued, often you try to be needed. And so you'll see women taking notes in the meetings, or making sure everybody's there, or did everyone get the email? Did everybody, like forwarding links, and that's fine. And I think it feels like it's relationship building, because in some ways it is, but it doesn't make you feel like a leader. It makes you feel like a secretary, right? That dynamic that you're creating is, yes, you're a great supporting person, right? But not, you're great at running this meeting and making things happen. And I think that model that you just shared, Stephanie, really helps put that into perspective of what kind of relationship you're developing by doing that. But I would love to hear any other thoughts on how to be more aware of that trap or get out of that trap, because it does feel like you're adding value and you're building relationships, but not in the right way, I think.
I'd love to hear more about that.
The book, I just looked it up. The podcast was with Mike Irwin, ERWIN, and it's entitled, what's his book entitled? Founder and CEO of Character and Leadership Center, co-author of Leadership is a Relationship. I think there's something there to dive into, because I know when I was at Lululemon for over 8 years, almost 9 years, we did the practice of leadership, one of the reasons why Lululemon has keeps their employees in a retail space, which is really a high turnover organization in retail, was they really gifted everybody the practice of leadership, leading self, leading others, leading organization. And embedded in that first pillar was relationship building. Connection was a key cultural value in that company, because of the fast pace with things that had to happen when you're expanding a company. They did internationally, was connection. It was hard. I'd have to say it was hard, because when you're dealing with a lot of different personalities, building those connections and being authentic, and then you still have to get things done. So it's not easy work. I think that's the thing. I think we think it's easy. It's not. You have to keep showing up and being willing to fail. And we use that word a lot. I wouldn't call it fail. And we need to coin another word for failure.
We we talk about that too, like
Yeah.
redefining failure and
Yeah.
having the bravery and the psychological safety to fail in a way that you're not failing,
Yeah.
you're learning something and you're moving forward.
This is a question for all of you. I'll start with June. I asked attendees from last week's session. They knew June would be coming on, and I asked attendees what they would like to hear from June. So there were a couple of questions, and I'd like to open up to everyone, but start with you, June. A few of our attendees last week are trying to figure out what their next role is, what their next job role will be, whether it's going out on their own, looking for full-time work again. And in this job market, knowing that you are going to be talking about building a personal brand and owning your power, the women were wondering, do you have any advice in terms of thinking about how to embrace your power to find that next role in a challenging job environment? The specific attendee that asked this question said to me, there's a lot of advice out there right now while you're looking for a job just to hone your resume and your identity to the specific position that's available. And then you might have a chance. You might, when you've talked about building your personal brand, there's a lot about defining who you are and what differentiates you. Do you have advice in this job market for women as they're thinking about how to embrace their power to find their next role?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I just did a workshop on finding your next position.
Okay.
Me that had been bought, and most of the employees were going to need to look for jobs. But I think it comes back to relationships
Mhm.
for almost everything. It starts with, how do you find an interview? Going out there and applying to a zillion jobs, it's needle in a haystack time, be a lot of work and a lot of nothing. The best way to do it is to talk to people. Go in your LinkedIn, go into somebody else's LinkedIn who you know. Go ask Christine or June if you can look at their LinkedIns, right? The best way to do it is through people who know you or know someone who knows you, because then they're going to care. And caring, again, you're going to hear me talk about emotions all the time, is the most powerful thing that can help somebody who cares about you. People who you apply to online, they don't care. Yeah, and if you're trying to do it that way, it's going to be better tailor your resume. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when you go to an interview, you want to be prepared to answer the question, tell me about yourself. And you do not, under any circumstance, want to deliver what is on your resume. In other words, you do not want to go through, let me tell you, I worked here first and then I worked there, because you know what that does? Puts people to sleep. I've already seen your resume. I read it. It's why we're talking, right? I don't want to hear you review that. What I want to hear to start is, I probably want to hear a story that engages me. I want to be both informed, but especially entertained, where I am going to fall asleep. And I want a way to connect to you, which means I need to feel you, not just hear some argument about why you're the best person. I don't want that. And for me, what I will do if I'm going into an interview is I start with a story, because it's immediately engaging. And it's a story about me. It depends upon what the job is and who I'm talking to. But many times I tell the story about how I made this transition into computers, and it's a detailed story about driving down 101. I won't tell you, but anyway, it's something that gets people to really listen to me to start, and then it makes a point. Usually the point I'm trying to make is about my personal brand, because as a marketer, what I know is I need to show someone who's hiring why I am different / better. Why me over anybody else? They're just looking at a whole bunch of people right now. So there's two things I'm trying to do in that interview. The first one is to make a case about why I'm better, but the second is to relate to the person in a way that they really like me, feel comfortable with me, and begin to trust me. And the word trust I use because I wanted to bring it up earlier. I think with relationships, it's all about building trust. And however you need to do it for whoever you're trying to build that relationship with, you should do it. But when someone trusts you, you can influence them much easier, and they can also influence you much easier. But it's about building trust as quickly as you can. And sometimes I can do it within minutes of starting an interview, because I create a connection. So how do I create a connection with the person? And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll get off my soapbox, a lot of the people talk, is I think when you go into an interview, it's really not about you. It's really about the person who's interviewing you. Don't be confused by the fact that you're the name of who's being interviewed. You are letting this person who's interviewing you feel heard. And the more they feel heard, the more they will hear you. And so what you want to do is find ways to engage them and let them talk. I always take time in interviews to say, what do you think? Or how are you feeling? Or is that what, and sometimes it just happens very naturally. And then you know you're having a really good interview. That's how you judge a good interview. But if it's not, you want to ask questions. You want that person to feel like they're being heard. And typically in most interviews, and you guys probably know this, in the end, you may have questions, but they're supposed to come into questions. Rarely do they come in with questions. Usually it's, okay, that's you. Now, what questions do you have for me? And I want to just say, screw you, I'm here to talk about me, but that's not how it works, right? It works like this. You try to get them to talk and to feel good and to feel comfortable with you. And if they feel comfortable and they start to trust you, they're going to have you back. It's that simple. So that's some advice that I've learned through many interviews in my career, and also seeing other people interview and what works and what doesn't.
June, we could talk to you for we could talk to you all day. This has been so valuable for all of us. Do you have one more minute for one more question? So Mary, Diana, Stephanie, and I talk about this a lot, as well as other members of the connection councils we're running, where women are coming together in groups of 6, like-minded women, but coming from different perspectives to lift each other up and support each other and help them figure out what's coming next. I was just curious, and we've talked about there's some sort of alchemy around bringing together powerful women coming from different groups to figure out what's next. There's been friendship, connection, support. I'm curious, in your career, have you had experiences like that where you have your powerhouse women groups that you're lifting each other up? And if so, what do you think the magic behind that is?
Wow, it's a great question. And I have to say, honestly, I've never really had a women's group. But I will say, I think it's, first of all, I just love you guys for doing this. And I think if I had, I would have been really happy if I'd found one like what you're doing, Christine. If I'd found the opportunity to be a part of one, it would have been unbelievably helpful for me, no matter where I was in my career. I think it's so awesome you guys are doing this, and I'm jealous. But I've actually done it for mixed sex groups. And I've done it in marketing contexts as well, where I've just brought councils together of people. And I'll tell you what, there's nothing like it, because it is about building trust with each other. It's about getting to know people. It's about feeling trust so that you can be more open about what's going on with you. And we don't often get that chance in business. We always have a slight front up, a slight making sure it's all okay. So it's nice to have a group where it's low risk to share and it's high return to share. I just love that you're doing it. And I think in business, when I do it with mixed groups, it works incredibly well too, because people get to know each other and then they trust each other. And trust is a really beautiful thing in building relationships.
Well, thank you so much, June. A little hidden secret when we were thinking about how we might format this to have a conversation with you. It's very much like a council format, and it is just a lovely way to connect. So thank you for teaching us today. And yeah, thank you for everything, June. Thank you, Stephanie, Diana, Mary.
Yes, you guys taught me too, and I loved your comments. I loved what you had to say. It was really interesting and thought-provoking. I'm going to go away and think about it the rest of the day, so I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.